Okay, welcome back. So we thought we'd have a bit more of a chat about this post office scandal. I suppose the first thing we should start with, Al, is why it's taken so long. And a lot of people, one of the comments I've seen come up a lot is, why has it taken a TV documentary to bring this about, for this to really come to justice? This is going to be a bit of a free-flowing video, everybody, to build on what we've done separately. What are your thoughts on that, Al?
Yeah, it's very interesting because, of course, lots of people have been commenting about this. In Private Eye have been running this story for sort of 10 plus years. The wheels of justice do turn slowly, but as people have commented, why did it take a television documentary to actually, bring this to the public conscience? But we've had this before, it's like the old Cathy Come Home documentary, everybody knew about the problems, but it took a TV drama before anybody did anything about it. And, I've seen lots of sort of ironic tweets and things where people saying, oh, I wish ITV would make a drama about the potholes in my road. And I think there is an element of that that's how we communicate to the public now. So it just goes to show the role of television drama. But at least things are happening now. The interesting thing is things are happening very quickly. And I think one thing we have to be careful of course, you can't leave these people hanging on any longer than necessary because they've waited so long for justice. But the danger is that in the rush, you just create more problems and more mistakes. And that's something I'll want to talk about in sort of future videos, especially, this idea of pardoning people by legislation. Lots of lawyers have been commenting on that and slightly concerned about it, not because we don't want people to be compensated, but is it necessarily the best way of doing it?
Absolutely. And there's also, I feel, an element that unless something directly affects an individual or a group of individuals, then there's not so much attention placed upon it. And so for a lot of things like this, it really is only the people involved that obviously experience it and suffer from it that give it the attention. But then there's no real need for anybody else to feel that they have to do anything with it. And nor can they in many instances, can they? So as you say, this has to be brought about by some legislation to move things in a different direction, because one of the videos I did is, why can they not just be immediately all pardoned en masse to say this was clearly wrong, they should all be pardoned en masse? And of course it's not that simple. I saw one comment criticizing the CCRC, so I thought I'd do that video explaining who they are, what they do, and effectively jumping to their defense to say, well, they can't just thrust a referral to the Court of Appeal for everybody for a couple of reasons. One is that it has to be with the consent of the person, and secondly, it's not automatic. There has to be a process in place. And so one has to remember that any of these people that have been prosecuted, whether it turns out by the post office as a private prosecution or even by the CPS, I think I read this morning was 27 cases. I'm not sure of the accuracy of that number, but I read that this morning.
I've seen the 27 figure quoted. I mean, I know there were definitely at least 6, and now I've seen 27 floating around. One thing to bear in mind is that not every prosecution of a sub-postmaster was related to the Horizon system. I mean, not disparaging any sub-postmasters because they've been through so much already, but, there were prosecutions just for things like fiddling stock and stuff like that falls outside this remit. That's one of the issues that we're looking at, will need to be looked at in the compensation scheme. I mean, the way they're talking about doing it is everybody. We see. I'll probably go through at some stage. Either you or I we can go through the actual, the form you have to fill in as a sub postmaster to claim compensation. But one thing you have to sign is a declaration saying I did not commit any criminal offences. So, theoretically that leaves open that if anybody was rightfully convicted, then yes, they would be getting the compensation. But then because they're signing the declaration of truth, that would permit, proceedings being brought against them for effectively, fraud by signing the box saying that, they hadn't committed offences if they had. But I mean, the one thing with this idea of just doing it as a sort of blanket legislation. I mean, I did my other video about, the Rwanda thing where, courts just saying, well, we will just pass legislation declaring something to be a fact. Two things here. I think, first of all, there's just the moral aspect of it, that I think people who, were in court, well, they were told they were criminals. They deserve to be back in court to be told they weren't criminals. Because, the point of pardons is, the executive, that is to say the government, they can just give pardon. They can just give pardons. They cannot give justice. And perhaps justice requires, the Court of Appeal to say, yes, these convictions were wrong, rather than, because, well, we're just going to blanket pardon you. Because, pardons were traditionally used for, well, actually, technically, you did commit the crime, but something has happened where you should not suffer the consequences of it. Pardons of people who, had committed a crime but then done something, so good, some separate good works, that it's like, oh, well, the social balance sheet is written out. It's balanced out now. So we're just going to effectively call it, a score draw. And I don't think that necessarily gives the vindication that the Court of Appeal saying, no, you were wrongly convicted because you were innocent, gives.
Absolutely. And a lot of people will have lost all of respect and all standing in a society, in their local communities, and many of those close-knit communities, many of them, of course, lost their houses, were declared bankrupt. Many of them, I read, were borrowing money to repay, and one of them I read this morning lost all contact with their grandchildren, and all sorts of horrific stories. And no pardon can just cut across all of that. Even the declaration from a court that this was wrong and you are not guilty, even that isn't going to fix all of that. Money, obviously, damages is the way that the court will assess wrongdoing. It's the only way that it can, unless many people ask the question, what can a court do about certain things? Well, what they're not likely to do is order anything outside of the remit of what's happened. So they will either order someone to do something, not to do something, or damages to compensate that for which has been wrong. And so what can the court do in this situation? Well, it has to follow the declaration that whether by legislation or the Court of Appeal that these convictions were wrong, and then what happens then. And so obviously with the government compensation schemes in place, following that, as you mentioned, Al, the Horizon. It was interesting that I read that the Horizon compensation scheme was originally titled the Historic Horizon Compensation Scheme, and renamed because, quite rightly, many of those affected said and felt that, well, no, this is not just historic, this is continuing to affect us. Because for many, it's destroyed their lives and still has done to this day. Because you can't undo all of that for so many years just by being part of a scheme that gives you some money. So it is very difficult to unravel this, and that's why, quite rightly, many people feel that this is just a failure of the system, is it not?
Well, yes, because there are two elements to consider here. There's the criminal side of it and the civil side of it. All the criminal Court of Appeal can say you were wrongly convicted and you are factually innocent, but they can't award compensation. So compensation can only be given through civil claims. So that would mean that people would have to claim for damages, whether it's... I mean, you can claim damages simply because, you've handed over money that you did not have to hand over money. There's this idea of what we call unjust enrichment, which is somebody has ended up with some money of yours that they weren't entitled to. You don't need to show that they were at fault in any way. It's just, oh, hang on, that has been paid by mistake. Now, obviously, you could also sue for fraud and deceit and conspiracy and all those sorts of issues. One thing I've noticed with the statutory scheme they're looking at is, they're looking at these blanket amounts, but it's things like loss of reputation, hurt feelings. Even in the employment tribunal, we have what we call these vento bans.